the story about the church is that it's dying. Have you heard this story? The church is dying. We've heard, I've only been here like half a day, and I've heard several different times people make reference to the church is dying, the church is dying. This is kind of the litany that we tell ourselves. So maybe you haven't made the best life choices, right? You're here thinking about going into a career where it's all going to die and go away, right? So that's kind of what I want to talk about. I've kind of described my journey. I'm a mainline Protestant sort of guy. I worked in the Methodist Church, UCC, Disciples of Christ. And that's the church that's supposed to be dying. I've talked to some of you are United Methodists. Are there Lutherans, maybe? No. Presbyterians, seems like I heard. So these are the ones, guys, these are the churches that are supposed to be dying. These are the ones that are going away, they're fading away. Just yesterday, you might not have seen it because the internet's not so great here, but just yesterday, Pew, I think, Research put out a new survey. They put these out like every 6 months, and it gives all the ministers just a heart attack. Right? Amen? So they, mainline Protestants dove by like 4% of the population, and the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, the people who say nun when you ask them, not the N-U-N-S, but the ones who say, I don't have any religious affiliation at all, those rose from like 3 to 7% or something of the population, I forget what. But it's like another one of these drumbeats, another one of these things saying, hey, your church is dying. So that's where I've spent most of my career, in those kinds of contexts. But I like to hang out with these emergent church folks. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Wild Goose Festival. Ever even heard of the Wild Goose Festival? I was talking to, was it Kevin who did the theology talk? Yeah. He went, we were talking about the Wild Goose, he went 4 years ago, I think. And that's kind of like the emerging church Woodstock, if you will, or like emerging church Burning Man. We talked about Burning Man earlier. It's kind of like that. It's in Hot Springs, North Carolina, and it's all these people who have this sense that whatever the church has been is done. Right? It's sort of like the writings on the wall. You can kind of see it. Last one out, last one to leave, turn out the lights, kind of thing. But these are all people who go to these things who really care more about not so much like saying a eulogy over what has been, but what's gonna be, what's gonna come along behind where we've been. So I thought I'd start by changing the title, The Future of Faith in an Old Christianity, because I actually kind of think that the future of faith lies in the way things were done in the past. Not always, but there's some stuff in the past, and Phyllis Tickle is actually pretty helpful here, where the church does, she says, have a yard sale every 500 years, and we throw out what's not useful. But sometimes you go to other people's yard sales, and you find things that are useful. So maybe sometimes that's what we can do as a church. So I want to ask you guys some questions. How many of you grew up in a church? Most of you, right? How many of you grew up in a Protestant mainline church, like the ones I've been talking about? Half of you-ish? Yeah. How many of you grew up in a Protestant mainline church that had a membership of like 100 to 150? Anybody? Like a mid-size, single pastor, no associates, a nice building with a steeple, maybe made out of brick. Like half the people in the room went to that kind of church. A Christian education building. So that is the church I grew up in. Literally, this is the church I grew up in. In Walnut Cove, 20 miles east of here, or west of here. You can go visit it. I drove by it today and thought about taking a better picture since this is off of Google Earth, but I decided not to get rear-ended while stopping in the middle of the road to take a picture of a church. So this is the church that I'm kind of describing. You know, it had one minister, no other staff at all. That guy did like the youth group to the children's Sunday school curriculum to the mowing the grass. He did the whole 9 yards. And we had you can't see it, but there's a little Christianette waiting back there, and it was fine. We had like 80 to 100 people in worship, 150 people on the books as members. You know, those kind of churches are the ones that have flourished for a long, long time. And that's the one everybody says is dying. So I want to talk about what the emergent churches see as coming along behind this. If this is dying, maybe it's not, I hope it's not, but if it is, what's coming along behind it? And the thing that these emergent churches seem to be pointing to, as far as I can tell, is back to the early part of the church. So academically, I study the catacombs. I had to chuckle. I think it was you that showed me the room where we were meeting this morning. You said, oh, it's back in the catacombs, or somebody said that to me. And I was like, ironically, I spent a lot of time in the catacombs in Rome, where there's all these paintings. But here are some like images that Christians painted of their early worship, and we'll talk more about these in a bit. You know, as a minister who happens to be a theologian and a historian who studies this period of time, say before the year 500, this is where it looks like things are going to be. So I think we can look back and see some things about the future by looking at the past. And here's what I see actually when I look to the early church. I see 5 kind of aspects of the early church. It was local, it was relational, it was authentic, and if you aren't keeping up writing these down, don't worry. You'll see these for a while. Justice-oriented, and it was diverse. So these 5 things, I'm sure there are others we could put up here, but to me, these are the 5 things that stand out about the early church. And I want to kind of spend some time talking about how these are pointing toward what the church is moving toward today, even though these are 2,000 years old, these concepts. And I'm curious to hear from you all, because most of you are millennials. I'm getting kind of tired of that language, but millennials, young people, whatever. And my hunch is, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, my hunch is you all know this already. This, you know, we were talking about this earlier with the leadership piece, the change, right? So it's often the older folks who have a hard time seeing things because we're stuck in our ways, but you all kind of know some of this. So tell me if I'm wrong on that. So I want to go through these one by one. So we'll start with local. Early Christian communities were really, really local. And sometimes I think it's easy to forget this because we live in these churches. You know, about half of you said you live in that kind of same church. You grew up in that same kind of church that I grew up in. So it's easy for us to read the New Testament or, you know, read early church history and think that they must have been in that same kind of church. But not really. They weren't really in those kind of churches. The churches where Paul, say, was writing to, the churches mentioned in Acts, had, and this is like sort of sociological work that people have done, they had memberships of 10, 15, 20 people. All right? And for us, I mean, we would declare a church insolvent, right? The ministers in the room. If you have 15 people, forget about it. You know, the bishop would never let you keep going. You'd lose your building. You know, there goes the mortgage. So, but the early church, this was kind of the critical mass. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. They weren't huge collections of people. There were no mega churches. There weren't even like mini churches. They were, you know, tiny little collections of people. In his letter to the Romans, one of my favorite books in the Bible, Paul makes reference to at least 5 congregations that he knows about in the city of Rome. And he's writing, you know, depending on who you ask, around the year 60. So already by the year 60, Paul didn't go to Rome and found that church. It was already there. It's the only church that he writes to that he wasn't the founder of. So already by then, there are at least 5 congregations that Paul knows about from over in Greece. He's heard about these people that he can write to. And that tells you there's not like First Christian Church of Rome, but there are tiny little local congregations. Not all cities in the empire were as big as Rome. Not that many had as many communities as Rome did, but it points to something, that it was profoundly local. So there's been this notion in scholarship for a long time, and if you've taken like a New Testament class or something, you've probably heard about house churches. And for a long time, scholars use this model. This is an atrium house is what it's called, typical Roman house. Usually is the caption for this in your textbook. Also in Latin, it's a domus. And this is, you know, scholars for a long time said, oh, okay, you know, rich people would have these houses, and there's an atrium here, and there's this courtyard back here. It gives lots of space, and all the Christians would come over. And you could fit maybe like 75 or 100 people back here if you really squeeze in, and the kitchen's usually right off to the side, so it works great. You know, that's where Christians met. And that was the story for a long time. But then people started kind of running the numbers on this. And in the city of Rome, we've already kind of talked about Rome, depending on who you ask, there's between 1 and 2 million people, which is huge. That's enormous, right, for the ancient world. But let's call it 1.5 million people, just for simplicity's sake. Of these 1.5 million people, about 50,000 of them lived in a house like this. All right, so not 50,000 houses like this, but 50,000 people living in a house like this. And I'm not real good at math, that's why I'm in religion business, but was it like 0.3% or something? 0.3, it's a very small percentage of people in Rome who would live in a house like this. So the probability that all the Christians had a house like this is vanishingly small. Pile onto that the fact that most Christians weren't of the upper classes. And Paul actually says, not many of you have a lot of high esteem in his letter, first letter to the Corinthians. So probably this isn't where they were meeting. They couldn't afford it. This is not where they lived. They were not part of the 1%, if you want to use the rhetoric of the 21st century. So where would they have lived? This is a different kind of place to live. It's called an insula in Latin. It's a tenement hall. It's an apartment building. Some of you have lived in places that look a lot like that. Some things never change, right? It's not actually all that different from a dorm. Today, the fashion in dorms is to put a cafeteria on the bottom floor. Yes, and you all have to ride the elevator to the top. So this is what happened in Rome. The only difference is these were built with sticks, like stick construction, not bricks, not cinder block. So they can only be about 4 stories high, as this one is. And the way it works, this bottom floor here is shops. You can see it's a little taller, has kind of large openings for people to roll out their wares. Could be a butcher shop, could be a fuller, a merchant, cloth merchant, something like that. And then the top floors are residential. And this to me is one of the most fascinating things about the ancient world and about the New Testament. That people who lived up there, the rooms were incredibly tiny in these places. So this room that we're in right now probably would have been 8 or 10 residences in a building like that. They were divided into these tiny, tiny little spaces. And there we have writers, ancient Roman writers, who talk about not even having enough space to lay down. Like you have to kind of curl up in your room. That's all the floor space you have. And the rooms, by the way, are not divided by walls. They're divided usually by rugs or blankets hanging from the ceiling. That's how you divide up the space. So you think your dorm room's bad or your apartment building's bad, think your neighbors are loud, try that. So probably what happened, most of the people lived in a place like this. This space is really different. This space is very provisional. You couldn't, like the sanctuary at the church where I work, it's used like an hour and a half a week, right? The rest of the time it sits there being a sanctuary with nobody in it. That's not possible here. So what happens here is you invite all of your Christian friends over for church. You push the beds to the side. Maybe you pull down the blanket between your apartment and the next to make a little bigger space. And you kind of pile in. Or maybe you do it down here on the bottom floor. Maybe you own a butcher shop and you just push all the stuff to the side after the hours are done. And you have your thing down there. That seems to have been the case sometimes. If you look in Acts chapter 20, you can see an example of this, where it's the story of Eutychus. If you've ever read that one, it's kind of a funny story. There's a couple little humorous stories in the New Testament. This is one of them. But Paul had gone to Troas, which is in Asia Minor, now Turkey, doing his little tour around. And he draws a crowd because he's Paul, right? So everybody comes to hear Paul talk. And we're told that it's on the 3rd floor, so it's not one of these. It's one of these. He's on the 3rd floor, and the room is full, and there's a young man named Eutychus. He's sitting in the window because it's really crowded, and he's, trying not to get bumped into and get in everybody's way. So he's sitting in the window, and Paul drones on and on because he's a preacher. Preachers tend to drone on and on. So Paul is going on and on. And eventually Eutychus falls asleep, falls out of the window, and dies. Or it's not totally clear whether he dies. But anyway, Paul goes down, says, oh no, he's fine. So this is where the ambiguity comes. Maybe he's dead, maybe Paul raises him. It's not actually all that clear. And then Paul, of course, is a preacher. So he goes back upstairs, preaches, it says, until dawn. Keeps going. He didn't get the hint. But that's the kind of story that can't make sense with this kind of a house. Early Christians met in that kind of a house. So much less privacy, much more provisional. You had to set up and take down every time. Now, I want to tell you about something that one of ILIF's graduates is doing in Denver. I think this church is so cool. This is a guy named Jerry Herschel. He does this thing called After Hours. We heard a little bit about this this afternoon with the church, with the example of, the bars. This is a church that meets in bars. They didn't buy the bar. They didn't, and it's not a church actually that decided to go from their building to the bar, but it's the United Methodist Church, the conference, the Rocky Mountain Conference decided we should pay this guy to be a minister to the bars. And so they go a couple different times a week, they go to a bar. And they usually go like on a Monday because that's a slow night for the bars and the bartenders are glad to have the business. And they invite people in and everybody sits around and they have church. They have church there. And the other thing they do is they make 100 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches every time they meet, and they pass them out to people who need them. They don't talk a lot about creeds or dogma. It's not a lot about what you believe, but it's more about being a hyper-local community where you can be in connection with other people. And look at that, it's flourishing. And he gets up, he says this, I talked to him once about, I was on a panel with him once about preaching the Hebrew Bible. And he's like, if I preach more than 3 to 4 minutes, people get up and like, go get another beer. He preaches like 3 to 4 minutes, he's done, right? It's just a different way of being church, it's hyper-local. And does this, look more like pious people kind of huddled in somebody's courtyard? Does it more look like push the chairs to the side in the butcher shop and have church in there? I think it looks more like that. So, I want to move into relational. You can already tell that After Hours is relational, right? It has to do with relationships. But there's more to relational than just that. So my friends and I have been trying to do something for a while. We call it Unchurch. So it's my wife and I, and our friends Joel and Lauren. And Joel and Lauren came to us and said, we have all these friends who would never go to church because they've been wounded by church, because churches have treated them badly, because they think it's hypocritical, what have you. You've all heard these before, right? And they're not wrong. Churches are hypocritical. They have wounded people, they've hurt people. So they have all these friends who won't go to church, but they feel like they need to be in community with these people. So what we did is we decided to start inviting all of our friends. And we, my wife and I have some friends that we invite. And they have some friends that they invite, and those friends have some other friends. And before you know it, you have this community that's built, again, not on dogma, not on kind of, can you recite the Westminster Confession or something, but it's built on, are we neighbors? Are we in community with one another? It's relational. So I want to know, how many of you have done something like that? Small community, anybody? Isn't campus ministry kind of like that? Is that?
Yeah.
Young Life, anybody ever do Young Life? These small group experiences where you find true community in a way that you don't maybe sitting in rows of pews on a Sunday morning listening to some guy talk. No offense, I'm the guy who talks a lot of the time. But it's not the same, right? Sitting around a couch, this is not us, by the way, I pulled this off the internet. I don't have any pictures of us. Sitting around a couch, talking about your week, talking about the struggles in your life, talking about the doubts you might have, that's profoundly different from sitting in rows listening to someone talk. If you think about the early church, again, I love Paul. Paul's my guy. If you think about how Paul works, Paul goes to a new town. Paul decides Corinth is where I need to be. Paul goes to Corinth, and he doesn't stand on a street corner and start preaching. And he doesn't really, rent out a storefront for his church and start having church there. What he does, in the Greek, he's a skenopoios, which can mean either tent maker or leather worker. And so it's not clear which one he is, but he does something with that. So he sets up his shop, he hangs up his shingle, and he starts doing his little business, and some guy comes in needing a tent, and so Paul starts making his tent, and along the way he says, hey, by the way, have I told you, about this experience I had with, I had this experience of the Messiah, and of course that gets their attention, so that they go on from there. It's profoundly relational. He starts making friends, and then he makes disciples of them. Or look at Romans 16. I already said I love Romans. Romans 16, I like to call the shout-out chapter. So Romans 1 through 15, very theological, very deep, and, you know, the kind of thing you ought to study deeply. Romans 16 is like, hey, say hi to Joe, basically. The whole chapter of that. And Paul seems to know all these people. Paul's never been to Rome. He talks a lot about how bad he wants to go to Rome. He's never been. And so but he knows all these people there. He's like, say hello to this person and greet my cousin, so-and-so. And, you know, I've heard about you who meet in this church. Please send my greetings to them. And he knows that the fastest way to foster community is to reach out to the people he already knows and to start making connections with those people. New Testament ethics. We talked earlier today about theology and ethics. New Testament ethics presume deep relationality. Look at 1 Corinthians. The whole first letter to the Corinthians is about people in relationship with each other and whether they do right by those relationships or not. Usually for the Corinthians, not so much, right? So one of the problems in Corinth, people are suing each other. All right? And this drives Paul crazy. He can't stand it. Another of the problems in Corinth, they're having the Lord's Supper, probably upstairs in an apartment complex. And people are showing up early and eating all the food before everybody else gets there. So these are broken kinds of community, broken relationships. And Paul thinks this is the worst thing you can do. So this is another of these catacomb pictures. These are all over the place in the catacombs. I once went to a whole conference at the University of Oxford, believe it or not, on these paintings, because people are trying to figure out what's going on in these. You know, is it an eschatological banquet where they're, you know, this is the dining with God in heaven at the end of time, or is it just a painting of a dinner, you know, or is it Eucharist? A lot of people call it a Eucharist, and I think it's probably depicting the agape. You might have heard the word agape before, one of the Greek words for love. That's what they called their communal meal. It was the agape meal. You all know this because you live close to Winston-Salem and you've heard of the love feast, right? The Moravian love feast. Moravians are in Winston-Salem, one of the only people who still do this with any regularity. But they have, around Christmas time, like sweet bread and cocoa or tea or something like that. And it's kind of like communion, but it's not exactly. And it's sacramental in a way that most traditions don't continue being sacramental. So this is what early Christians were doing. They sat down, they called it the love when they sat down to eat together. They called it the agape. And they sat down and ate. So to me, that's not so different from this. Christian communities are moving toward this. They're moving away from big steeple churches with rows of pews, and they're moving toward, let's be together with people we care about and talk about things that are important. That's not new, that's old. Authentic. Different traditions look for authenticity in different places and times. So if you are, say, Lutheran, you probably look to like 16th century Germany for your authenticity. If you're Presbyterian, you might look to Calvin and his communities. I'm Disciples of Christ, so we tend to look to the book of Acts. You know, everybody's got their places. Baptists look to the Reformation, the Radical Reformation. Everybody kind of sees authenticity in a different place and time. Wherever you find authenticity, wherever your tradition locates authenticity, you can be certain that that authenticity will be important to people. That it's important to be authentic to who you are. People crave things that are real, that are not manufactured. People can't stand being marketed to. That's kind of why I don't like being an admissions rep, like at things like this, because you know I'm marketing to you, and you kind of resent it on one level. We need each other because I know things about school, and you want to know things about school, but people don't like being sold stuff, right? So authenticity, I think, is important because if you are tapping into something real, then people will recognize that it's real and find it important. So, anybody ever heard of Nadia Bowles-Weber? Nadia? Yeah. She wrote a book called Pastrix recently. She's kind of like famous around now. She's an ILF grad, and she's like a rock star, man. If you've ever been in the same room as her, she's just one of these human beings that owns the room, and she's like 6'2", tattooed head to toe. Awesome. This is her down here. You can kind of see some of her tattoos. That's her up in the corner. But Nadia was like a stand-up comic, I think. in her previous life. She was into all sorts of like bad stuff. She was drunk all the time. She did drugs. Didn't take care of herself very much. She talks all about this in her book, which I recommend. It's really funny because she was a stand-up comic. So was Jerry Herships, by the way, the guy in the bars. So I don't know what it is. Maybe before you go to seminary, you should all go be stand-up comic. But Nadia graduates from seminary, and she says, you know, nobody's doing real authenticity. So she's a Lutheran. She's in the ELCA. And she gets that way, by the way, because she marries a Lutheran minister. She didn't grow up anything, and she went through this long kind of wilderness period in her life. And she finds God, strangely enough, through her marriage, and she goes to seminary, and she graduates, gets ordained. And she founds a church called the House for All Sinners and Saints. And she does that, I think, for two reasons. One, because she thinks it's really important that the words sinner and saints are juxtaposed with the word all. Everybody's welcome. The other reason she did it is because House for All Sinners and Saints abbreviates as half-ass. And she is a very profane woman. She loves to curse, which is what I love about her. So it's kind of funny. Like if you ever get a chance to meet her, you'll see. But it's authentic to its tradition. She's a Lutheran, and they do really Lutheran stuff there. Like really Lutheran. They do 16th century German liturgy there. They do like high church, you know, old spooky stuff. They do processions with relics around the block in downtown Denver. You can see like the smoke and all the pomp and circumstance. But they do it, they're authentic to that tradition, but they do it in a way that's authentic to themselves. So if you look, it's kind of dark, you probably can't see, but if you look at, say, these people, these are not like, I don't know, when I think of like stuffy Lutheran liturgy, I don't picture these people. The people who go to her church are authentic to who they are. They're young, they're old, they're gay, a lot of them are gay, they're straight. You probably can't tell from these, but for Denver, there's a great deal of diversity in that church. Racial diversity, all kinds of diversity, economic diversity, there's homeless people, there's people who show up in suits. It's a remarkable community. They hold it all together somehow. One of the first things she'll always say about her church, she says, you know, if you show up on like a Sunday night when they have church, and you look around, your first question is, what do all these people have in common with each other? What are they doing here together? This is kind of opposite of the meet in your living room thing where it's clear what everyone has in common. But for these people, it's not clear what they all have in common. These are people from very different places in life. And what they have in common is that they have found a community where they can be authentic to themselves and to a tradition. So again, 16th century Lutheran liturgies are not new. But the way they're being instantiated in this community is new. The way that they're being brought out in this community is new. So this brings me to the fourth aspect. Emerging and emergent churches, the churches of the future, you could say, are justice-oriented. And I think this is almost like an absolute. I don't think, you know, sometimes they are. I think almost all the time, this is what they do. This is what they're about. Now this might seem like an obvious thing to do. Churches ought to be oriented toward justice. Seems like a smart thing. But churches have not always been oriented toward justice. Am I right? Like sometimes churches have been oriented quite directly away from justice. Churches have not always been on the side of the right. And so there's a little joke here. This is actually a picture that Nadia Bolz-Weber tweeted. She's big on Twitter. And you probably can't see it very clearly. We were talking about Kansas City earlier. Maybe we don't love Kansas City. This is a church in Kansas City. It's called Country Club Christian Church. And so Nadia posted a picture, and she's like, maybe this will be my next call. You know, I can go live at the country club. And actually, I happen to know this church, and I know the minister. It's a great church. They do great work. They're not a country club. But it's a funny joke on Twitter because it's called Country Club Christian Church. And this is actually how a lot of churches are. They're a country club. They're for like people, self-satisfied kind of people to go and feel good about themselves. That's what they do, right? And I've been a member of any of these churches, but I've attended a lot of these churches where, you know, it's a social club. People show up because they want to be seen showing up. And there's not a lot of justice going on. The early church was radically just. The early church was radically just. At least that's the story it liked to tell about itself. I'm sure it wasn't as just as it liked to say it was. But the early church seems to have been oriented around justice in a remarkable kind of way. So you can look at something like the book of Acts. Pentecost is coming up soon. The story of Pentecost and the rest of the early part of Acts is really a story about people living in a commune. We heard about the work of Karl Marx this morning, not this morning, it's early afternoon in the theology session. And we talked about how Karl Marx was sort of behind some of the theology of the 20th century. But Karl Marx was kind of behind some of the theology of the first century. We don't like to admit this, but people were being kind of socialist there in the first century. They put everything into a common pot. Whoever needed something took it out of that pot. It didn't last very long. It's not, like a real good ongoing concerned social system. But they did it for a while. This is what they tried to do. They tried to hold things in common. They tried to give as they had means to give and receive as they had need. Or back to 1 Corinthians. What's Paul worried about there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, right, or 11, where the people are abusing the Lord's Supper? He's worried about justice. He's worried about people, really it comes down to economic justice. People who showed up early because they didn't have to work late, ate all the food. And the people who had to work late got there and didn't get to eat anything. And the earlier people are drunk already on the wine. And so and he's like, go eat at home. If you're that hungry, go eat at home. You have food at home. These people don't. And they have, they're not able to come at the same time. So it's kind of a justice concern for Paul. Or read Luke, the Gospel of Luke, the Beatitudes in Luke. Anybody take a Bible class? I know you did. Pop quiz. What's the difference between the Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke? Anybody know?
Poor in spirit versus poor.
Yeah, so there's two differences. One is that Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit, which is nice. Yes, they are. Let's hope so, that they are blessed. Luke says, blessed are the poor, which is different from the poor in spirit. And Luke also says, though, and woe to you who are rich. Luke adds this woe. And so, as like a person with a great deal of privilege in the world, I'm a professor, I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight, I have a lot of privilege in this world, I have economic privilege. I read Matthew and I'm like, oh yes, that's really wonderful. But I read Luke and I feel kind of, I'll use an old evangelical word, convicted. I feel convicted, right? So Luke is worried about justice in a way that maybe even the other Gospels aren't. So you can find these deep, deep trends of justice in the New Testament. So there's a new church start in Denver. I'm talking about Denver because that's where I live. But these places, somebody who's from Durham. They're from Durham. There's stuff going on in Durham. I hear about Durham in Denver. Right? Denver is one of the hotbeds of justice work in the Christian community in the United States. Apparently I went to high school with this guy, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. You guys heard of this guy? We were in high school at the same time. I never met him, but he's like a big shot. I don't know. So they're doing all sorts of great work. But in Denver, more Iliff grads started this church called Kadash. And it's a church for immigrants and homeless people. And there are some people in the church who are not immigrants and homeless people, but the church is not for them in the same kind of way. It's for people who are in the country and they aren't from here, and it's for people who don't have a place to live. There are also some middle class folks in there. But the board of directors is very intentionally people who are homeless, people who are immigrants in the land. So what's the major ministry of this congregation? It's food justice. They've decided this is the place where people from the place in society that they come from, this is the place where they can function best. Food justice. And so they go around, they teach people how to plant gardens. These are homeless people going around teaching people how to plant gardens because they believe this is what God has called them to do. They go around, and Denver is like any other major city. There's blighted kind of areas. And they find a lot that's, there used to be a building there and it fell down, or, somebody abandoned it, or the house was razed or something like that, burned down, and they'll take that lot and they'll move all the stuff off of it. And they'll plant a garden there. And the food that they raise, people can come and get if they need food. The homeless people can come in and harvest the food for their meals. And they teach people how to tend soil. How do you prepare soil? How do you plant things that you won't live to harvest? This is what they're all about. In the summer, they take food and water to day laborers. So if you've ever been, maybe you've seen this before, people line up at, say, 6 o'clock in the morning to get work. And these are people who, some guy at a landscaping truck will come by and say, I need 5 guys for the day, pick them up and take them off to work. So you got to go at 5 o'clock in the morning and line up for this work, this kind of work, because if you're not there, you're at the end of the line, you're probably not going to get work. And you don't dare get out of that line either, because if you get out of line and the truck comes by, you don't get to work that day. And if you don't get to work, you don't get to eat that day. And your kids don't get to eat that day. So these guys, this church, goes around and they take food and water, and in the winter they take coffee because it can get cold in Denver. And they make sure that these people who are at the very bottom of society have something that they can eat, and they have something to drink. It's not that different from what was happening in the book of Acts. They do immigration attorneys. They help people with asylum requests, people who are in the country without documentation. They honor that biblical injunction to care for the alien in the land. And all of this is done out of a place of understanding that the most authentic church is a church that's embedded in the work of justice. I have this creed up here. I thought it would be neat to look at. There's a creed that the Maasai people in East Nigeria wrote, and I love this whole creed. I recommend that you look it up. Go Google it and look it up. It comes from a book called Credo by Yaroslav Pelikan, where he went around collecting creeds. But what I love about this is the Maasai people kind of translated it into their own vernacular. And my favorite line is talking about Jesus. He was always on safari doing good. And to me, that's just beautiful. He wasn't on safari, which I love that line. He wasn't out there being pious. He wasn't always on safari believing the right stuff or pleasing people with power. He was always on safari doing good. I love that. Finally, diverse. I'll explain what this is in a minute. If you ask sociologists, I got what, 15 minutes? I won't take the whole time. If you ask a sociologist about my age, I'm either like the youngest of the Generation X people, or I'm the oldest of the millennials, right on that edge. Probably I'm the youngest of the Generation X. But I feel more like I'm part of your generation. Maybe that's just self-delusion that I like to feel. I hung out last night in downtown Winston, because I live in Colorado. I hung out with some of my high school friends, and we're at some little chic bakery downtown Winston, and we were like the oldest people in there. It's all these Wake Forest students. We just sat there and stared at each other like, are we really this old? Yes, we really are this old. But what I've admired about your generation, those of you who are millennials, and I work as a youth minister, so I know people your age pretty well. What I admire about you is that you all get diversity in a way that even people of my generation, I'm probably 20 years older than you, 15, 20 years older, we don't get it in the same way that you do. You guys get diversity. And the early church was remarkably diverse. And by the way, our evangelical brothers and sisters were on top of this thing long before the mainline Protestants. Credit where credit is due. Evangelicals have done diversity much, much better than mainline Protestants for a long time. So I think there's something where we have something to learn from each other. But it seems to me millennials in the millennial church and the emerging church has this sense that we are better because of our differences. That we don't all have to be the same in order to be strong together. And this, I think, is something that was very present in the early church. So if you look at the early church, and again, we can go back to Romans 16. I love Romans 16. There's this, what's it called? Prosopography. Drop that at your next party that you're at. Learn about prosopography. Prosopography is the study of, it comes from the root for face. It's a study of learning about people's identities from little bits of literary data. And so Romans 16 is a gold mine for prosopography. because he does all these shout outs. And what do we learn about the people he's shouting out to? They are overwhelmingly slaves. They have slave names. In Rome, you had very distinctive names if you were a slave. They were freed slaves, freed people. They were merchants. A few of them were merchants, not that many, but people who had some, level of they weren't going to starve to death the next day. Shop owners who might well have starved to death the next day. The shop owners did not do very well in Antiquity. They were widows. They were orphans. They were women, overwhelmingly. He was mentioning women when he wrote, who didn't, of course, have a lot of status in the world. But he also mentions someone in the household of Caesar. All right, so he's mentioning people from lots of different times, or lots of different places. People with Greek names, people with Jewish names, people with Roman names, people whose names pointed to origins in slavery, people whose names pointed to the imperial household. Great diversity of people. Scholars, this is a map out of, I think it's Peter Lampa's book. It's a very boring book, I don't recommend it. But his work is thrilling. And he's this German guy who discovered, you can, through various means, you can figure out what neighborhoods Christians lived in the city of Rome in, say, the first 200 years, 300 years. And it turns out they lived in really three places. They lived here on the Aventine Hill. If you've ever been to Rome, this is kind of where the Circus Maximus is. And this is a very mixed neighborhood. You have some really wealthy people, you have some really, really poor people. They lived up here in the Field of Mars, Campus Martius. This was a very poor area. And they lived here in the Trastevere, which means across the Tiber. The Tiber is this river that runs through Rome. And this is like being on the wrong side of the tracks, this neighborhood. This is where you came to, if you came to Rome, you fled your home in the country, you come to Rome to try to make your way in the world, you probably settled there. A lot of the docks were there because the river's there. It's a very ethnically diverse place. This is where these two neighborhoods here and the one up here are where Christians live. They didn't live over here in the wealthier parts of town, in the more status-laden parts of town. They lived in the parts of town where there was incredible diversity. So the question is, did Christianity succeed? And it succeeded dramatically. Did it succeed in spite of the diversity that it was encountering? Or did it succeed because of the diversity it was encountering? And I think that it succeeded because of the diversity, because it was in a place where there was incredible diversity. So, if you noticed, all the slides I pointed to earlier have some kind of diversity. I'm putting some of these pictures back up again. Some of them display diversity across people who are interested in traditional kinds of church or not. There's church, high Lutheran liturgy. There's church that's sitting in a bar drinking a beer. There's diversity in some of these churches of race, as much as is possible in the Rocky Mountain West. There's diversity in terms of sexuality, people who express their sexuality in very different kinds of ways. National origin, people who come from different places in the world and find themselves together. There's diversity really of dramatic kinds. The emerging and emergent churches, the church of the future, gets this in a way that the church I grew up in could never get. The church I serve now could never get it. We'd like to say we can, but we can't get it. So what's coming next for Christianity, the new kind of faith, I think has much more in common with the old kind of faith than it does with the faith of my childhood. The church that's coming, I don't actually care that much. When I read these Pew studies, that come out, the church is dying. Hallelujah, right? I was thinking this afternoon, I keep saying this morning, when Kevin was talking about the dead white men. All the theologians are dead white men. And I thought, and he said you have to keep reading them, you have to know them pretty well. And I thought, yes, you have to keep them alive so that they stay dead. Right? You keep reading them because that needs to stay in the past. They need to stay dead. And the people who are in this room, frankly, are going to be writing the theology for the 21st century. And people like you who are thinking about going to seminary today, who are trying to make that decision, where to go, what to do with your life, you're the ones who get to write the story next. And I hope, what we'll learn is that the church of the future will be like the church of the past, like the church of the early church, and that it'll be local and dramatic, profound kind of ways. It'll be relational in a way that you can't get sitting in pews in a straight line listening to somebody talk at you. It'll be authentic to you, and it'll be authentic to the traditions you come from. It'll be oriented toward justice in deep, deep ways that transcend what the church has done up to this point. And it will be diverse in ways that wouldn't have been imaginable decades ago even. That's the end of my talk. If you